Imagine walking into a room and immediately sensing the unspoken tension between two people who are smiling at each other. Imagine feeling the collective anxiety of a crowd before anyone has said a word about what's troubling them. Imagine knowing with disturbing accuracy that someone is lying, that a relationship is failing, or that a situation is about to explode, while everyone around you acts as if everything is perfectly normal. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. You're part of what psychologists estimate is roughly 15 to 20% of the population, the highly intuitive, the deeply sensitive, the ones who see what others cannot or will not see. But here's the problem that no one talks about. This extraordinary perceptual gift can become a psychological prison that slowly destroys your peace of mind, your relationships, and your ability to function in a world that seems designed for people who see less, feel less, and question less. Right now, thousands of highly intuitive people are suffering in silence, overwhelmed by perceptions they can't shut off, insights they can't ignore, and truths that no one wants to hear. They're told they're too sensitive, overthinking everything, or making things up. They're gaslit by a society that mistakes emotional numbness for mental health and surface-level thinking for wisdom. But what if there was another way? What if the very psychological framework that could save you from intuitive overwhelm was developed over a century ago by a brilliant Swiss psychiatrist who understood exactly what you're going through? What if Carl Jung, one of the most profound psychological minds in history, left us a survival manual specifically designed for people like you? Before we embark on this life-changing journey, we need you to engage with this content. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button if you already recognize yourself in what we're describing, and drop a comment telling us about a time when your intuition proved right in a way that others couldn't see. Share this with someone who understands what it's like to see too much, feel too deeply, and know too much for their own comfort. Over the next few minutes, we're going to reveal 5 specific Jungian tools that will transform your relationship with your intuitive gifts. These aren't just theoretical concepts, they're practical psychological techniques that have helped countless sensitive souls navigate an insensitive world. The revelation waiting at the end of this exploration will fundamentally change how you understand your place in the world and give you the power to thrive rather than merely survive. Are you ready to discover how to protect and channel your extraordinary perceptual gifts? Let's begin by acknowledging something that mainstream psychology often overlooks. Being highly intuitive in a predominantly sensory-focused world is like being a deep-sea creature suddenly thrown into shallow water. The very gifts that make you extraordinary also make you vulnerable in ways that others simply cannot comprehend. Carl Jung, in his groundbreaking work Psychological Types, identified intuition as one of the 4 primary psychological functions alongside thinking, feeling, and sensation. But he understood something crucial that modern psychology often misses. Intuitive types don't just think differently. They perceive reality through entirely different channels. While sensor types focus on immediate, concrete information, intuitives are constantly processing patterns, possibilities, and meanings that exist beneath the surface of observable reality. Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive persons reveals that approximately 15–20% of humans possess what she calls sensory processing sensitivity, a neurological trait characterized by deeper cognitive processing, heightened emotional reactivity, and greater awareness of environmental subtleties. But here's what her research doesn't fully capture. For many highly sensitive people, the sensitivity extends far beyond the physical senses into what Jung called unconscious perception. Think about this carefully. Have you ever walked into a building and immediately felt uncomfortable without knowing why, only to later discover it had a tragic history? Have you ever met someone and instantly distrusted them, despite their charming demeanor, only to have your suspicions confirmed months or years later? Have you ever felt overwhelmingly sad or anxious in certain locations or around certain people, absorbing emotions and energies that weren't originally yours? This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the participation mystique, the unconscious psychic connection that sensitive individuals have with their environment and other people. It's not mysticism, it's psychology. Your nervous system is literally wired to pick up information that others miss. But this same wiring makes you vulnerable to psychological overwhelm, emotional exhaustion, and what we might call reality poisoning. The modern world, with its constant stimulation, artificial environments, and collective denial of emotional and spiritual realities, can feel like psychological torture for someone with this level of sensitivity. But Jung understood that this torture isn't inevitable. It's the result of not understanding how to work with your psychological type. But before we reveal the tools that can transform this burden into a blessing, we need to understand why the intuitive experience has become so much more difficult in the modern world. Here's a disturbing truth that explains why being highly intuitive feels more overwhelming now than ever before. Our modern technological society has created what Jung would call a collective neurosis, a shared psychological imbalance that particularly targets and destabilizes intuitive consciousness. Dr. Gabor Mate, renowned physician and expert on trauma and addiction, explains that our current social structure systematically disconnects people from their authentic emotional and intuitive responses. We live in what he calls a trauma-inducing society that rewards conformity, surface-level thinking, and emotional suppression while pathologizing depth, sensitivity, and authentic emotional expression. Consider the psychological environment that highly intuitive people must navigate daily. Constant digital stimulation that fragments attention, artificial lighting that disrupts circadian rhythms, processed foods that destabilize mood and energy, urban environments that disconnect us from natural cycles, and social media algorithms designed to trigger emotional reactivity rather than promote genuine connection. But the assault goes deeper than environmental factors. Jung warned about what he called the inflation of consciousness, the modern tendency to believe that rational, ego-driven thinking is the only valid form of knowledge. This creates what we might call intuitive invalidation, a systematic cultural gaslighting of anyone who processes information through non-rational channels. Dr. Ian McGilchrist's groundbreaking research in The Master and His Emissary reveals that Western civilization has become pathologically left-brain dominant, emphasizing linear, analytical, reductionist thinking while suppressing the holistic, pattern recognition and contextual awareness that characterizes right-brain processing. For intuitive types who naturally rely on right-brain functions, this creates a constant sense of being misunderstood and invalidated. Think about this. How often are you told that your concerns are unfounded because you can't provide concrete evidence for what you're sensing? How often are your accurate intuitions dismissed because they came through feeling rather than thinking? How often are you made to feel crazy for perceiving patterns and connections that others can't see? This systematic invalidation of intuitive consciousness creates what Jung called neurotic splitting, a painful disconnection from your authentic psychological nature. But Jung also provided the tools to heal this split. What made Carl Jung different from other psychologists of his era, and what makes his work uniquely valuable for highly intuitive people, was his understanding that psychological health isn't about conforming to social norms, but about developing what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who others expect you to be. Jung experienced his own crisis of intuitive overwhelm during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious between 1913 and 1919. During this period, he was flooded with visions, dreams, and unconscious material that threatened to destroy his sanity. But rather than suppress these experiences or seek conventional treatment, he developed specific techniques for working with overwhelming psychological content. From this personal crisis emerged some of the most profound psychological insights in history, including his understanding of what he called psychological containers, mental and emotional structures that allow sensitive individuals to experience intense psychological material without being destroyed by it. These containers aren't about suppression or denial, they're about conscious engagement with unconscious content. Dr. Robert Johnson, one of Jung's most important interpreters, explains that Jung discovered something crucial. The same psychological sensitivity that makes you vulnerable to overwhelm also makes you capable of extraordinary psychological growth and insight. The key is learning to work with your sensitivity consciously rather than being at its mercy. Jung's approach was radically different from conventional psychology because he understood that for intuitive types, the goal isn't to become normal, it's to become whole. He recognized that highly sensitive, intuitive individuals serve a crucial function in human society. They're the early warning system, the pattern recognizers, the ones who sense what's coming before it becomes obvious to everyone else. But this crucial social function comes with enormous psychological risks. Without proper tools and understanding, intuitive individuals can become overwhelmed by their own perceptual gifts, leading to anxiety, depression, addiction, and what Jung called inflation. Losing yourself in the overwhelming intensity of unconscious material. This is where the 5 tools we're about to reveal become not just helpful, but essential for psychological survival. These tools have been tested not just in Jung's clinical practice, but by thousands of highly sensitive individuals over more than a century. But first, we need to understand why conventional approaches to managing sensitivity fail so spectacularly. Here's why most advice for highly sensitive people not only fails, but can actually make things worse. It's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how intuitive consciousness works. Conventional approaches treat sensitivity as a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be developed. Take the most common advice given to sensitive people. Don't take things personally. Set better boundaries, practice mindfulness, or think more positively. While well-intentioned, these suggestions reveal a complete misunderstanding of intuitive processing. For someone who naturally perceives the emotional and psychological atmosphere around them, not taking things personally is like telling someone to stop breathing. Dr. Judith Orloff, author of the Empath Survival Guide, points out that traditional boundary-setting techniques often fail for highly intuitive people because they're designed for individuals who process information primarily through thinking and sensation. Intuitive types need different kinds of boundaries, what she calls energetic boundaries, that protect their psychological space while still allowing their natural perceptual gifts to function. Even mindfulness practices, while valuable, can sometimes backfire for highly intuitive individuals. Standard mindfulness techniques encourage awareness of present moment experience, but for someone who naturally picks up on subtle emotional and energetic information, increased awareness can lead to sensory and emotional overwhelm rather than peace. Jung understood this problem and developed what he called active imagination, a specific form of conscious engagement with unconscious material that allows intuitive types to work with their perceptions without being overwhelmed by them. Unlike passive meditation, active imagination provides structure and direction for processing psychological content. The fundamental issue is that most approaches to sensitivity assume that the goal is to feel less, perceive less, and be affected less by your environment. But Jung recognized that for true intuitive types, this approach leads to psychological death. The goal isn't to shut down your perceptual gifts, it's to develop the psychological structures that allow you to use them consciously and constructively. This brings us to the 5 specific tools that Jung developed for protecting and channeling intuitive consciousness. These tools don't suppress your sensitivity, they transform it into a source of strength and wisdom. Are you ready to discover how to work with your gifts rather than against them? The first and perhaps most important tool is what Jung called active imagination, a specific technique for consciously engaging with the overwhelming psychological material that intuitive types naturally absorb. This isn't daydreaming or wishful thinking, it's a structured method for processing unconscious content without being destroyed by it. Here's how active imagination works for intuitive protection. When you sense something disturbing, whether it's picking up on someone's hidden emotions, feeling the psychological atmosphere of a place, or being flooded with anxious premonitions, instead of trying to suppress these perceptions or analyze them rationally, you create what Jung called a psychological container. The process involves 3 steps. First, acknowledge the perception without judgment. Second, personify or visualize the psychological content as a separate entity, perhaps as a character, symbol, or image. Third, engage in conscious dialogue or interaction with this personified content, allowing it to express itself fully while maintaining your psychological boundaries. For example, if you walk into a room and immediately feel overwhelmed by sadness that isn't yours, instead of trying to think positive or set boundaries, you might visualize this sadness as a gray figure and ask it directly, "What are you trying to tell me? What do you need? How can I acknowledge you without taking you on as my own?" Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, explained that active imagination transforms passive overwhelm into active engagement. Instead of being a victim of your perceptions, you become a conscious participant in psychological reality. This technique requires practice, but it's extraordinarily effective for preventing what Jung called unconscious identification, the tendency to lose yourself in the psychological material you're perceiving. The second tool addresses one of the most challenging aspects of intuitive consciousness, the tendency to perceive not just beauty and truth, but also darkness, deception, and uncomfortable realities that others prefer to ignore. Jung's concept of shadow work provides a framework for dealing with these darker perceptions without becoming cynical or overwhelmed. Jung defined the shadow as the rejected, denied, or undeveloped aspects of personality and society. Highly intuitive people often become unwilling repositories for collective shadow material. They're the ones who see through social facades, who sense hidden agendas, who feel the undercurrents of violence, greed, and deception that run beneath civilized society. The conventional response to these darker perceptions is either denial, "That can't be true," or identification, "The world is evil and hopeless." Both responses are psychologically damaging. Shadow work offers a third option, conscious integration without identification. The process involves recognizing that your ability to perceive darkness is actually a gift that serves both individual and collective healing. When you can see what others cannot or will not see, you become capable of bringing unconscious material into consciousness, which is the first step in transformation. Practical shadow work for intuitives involves 3 practices. First, maintain what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into either extreme. Second, develop what he called ethical responsibility, understanding that perceiving shadow material creates an obligation to engage with it consciously rather than projecting it onto others. Third, practice psychological discrimination, learning to distinguish between shadow material that belongs to you, shadow material that belongs to others, and shadow material that belongs to the collective. This tool is crucial because it prevents what Jung called inflation by the negative, becoming so identified with dark perceptions that you lose your capacity for joy, hope, and creative engagement with life. The third tool, amplification, addresses the fact that highly intuitive people often receive information through symbolic, metaphorical, and non-literal channels that others dismiss as meaningless or irrational. Jung's technique of amplification provides a method for decoding and working with symbolic communication. Amplification involves taking symbolic or imagistic material that emerges from unconscious perception and connecting it to universal human patterns and meanings. Instead of dismissing your symbolic perceptions as just imagination, you learn to read them as legitimate forms of psychological communication. For example, if you consistently have the image of a bridge when thinking about a particular relationship, instead of dismissing this as random mental content, amplification would involve exploring the universal symbolic meanings of bridges: connection, transition, passage from one state to another, potential for crossing but also potential for collapse. Jung collaborated with mythologist Mircea Eliade to develop what they called comparative symbolism, the understanding that certain images and symbols carry universal psychological significance. When you learn to read symbolic language, you gain access to a much richer and more nuanced understanding of psychological reality. The practical application involves keeping what Jung called an imagination journal, recording symbolic images, dreams, and spontaneous visualizations, then researching their mythological, cultural, and psychological associations. Over time, you develop fluency in symbolic communication, which dramatically enhances your ability to understand and work with intuitive perceptions. This tool is particularly valuable for highly intuitive people because it validates and gives structure to forms of perception that rational culture typically dismisses. The fourth tool involves developing what Jung called type consciousness, a deep understanding of your natural psychological gifts and limitations, which allows you to work with your intuitive nature rather than fighting against it. Jung identified four main psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Most people have one dominant function and one well-developed auxiliary function, while the other two remain largely unconscious. For intuitive types, problems arise when you try to force yourself to operate primarily through thinking or sensation, functions that may be less developed in your psychological makeup. Type consciousness involves several practical applications. First, recognizing that your intuitive perceptions are just as valid as sensory observations or logical conclusions. They're simply different forms of information processing. Second, understanding that your natural way of perceiving and processing information is not wrong or inferior. It's simply different from the dominant cultural preference for sensory and thinking functions. Third, learning to communicate your intuitive insights in ways that thinking and sensation types can understand and appreciate. This doesn't mean suppressing your intuitive nature, but rather developing what Jung called auxiliary functions that allow you to translate intuitive insights into practical applications. This tool helps prevent the psychological damage that occurs when highly intuitive people try to conform to psychological types that don't match their natural gifts and inclinations. The fifth and culminating tool is individuation, Jung's term for the lifelong process of becoming your authentic self, rather than conforming to external expectations or collective norms. For highly intuitive people, individuation is not just personally fulfilling, it's psychologically necessary for survival. Individuation for intuitive types involves several key elements. First, accepting that you will always perceive and process reality differently from the majority of people, and that this difference is valuable rather than problematic. Second, developing the courage to trust your perceptions even when others cannot validate them through conventional means. Third, finding or creating communities and relationships with others who appreciate and understand your psychological nature. Jung understood that individuation doesn't happen in isolation. It requires what he called meaningful encounters with others who can witness and reflect your authentic self. Fourth, discovering your unique contribution to collective consciousness, the specific way your intuitive gifts serve not just your personal growth, but the evolution of human understanding and awareness. These 5 tools work together to create what Jung called a conscious personality, someone who can fully utilize their psychological gifts while maintaining psychological stability and emotional well-being. But implementing these tools requires understanding how they work together as an integrated system. Now that we've explored each tool individually, let's understand how they work together to create a comprehensive framework for intuitive survival and thriving. These aren't separate techniques to be used in isolation. They're interconnected elements of what Jung called the transcendent function. The integration begins with active imagination as your primary tool for processing overwhelming psychological material. When you encounter something that threatens to overwhelm your sensitive nervous system, you immediately create a psychological container through active imagination, allowing you to engage consciously with the material rather than being flooded by it. Shadow work then provides the ethical framework for engaging with difficult or disturbing perceptions. Instead of becoming cynical or hopeless when you perceive darkness, you use shadow work principles to engage with these perceptions in a way that promotes healing rather than further wounding. Amplification gives you the interpretive tools to understand the symbolic and metaphorical dimensions of your perceptions, preventing the confusion and self-doubt that often accompany non-rational forms of knowing. Type consciousness ensures that you're working with your natural psychological gifts rather than trying to force yourself into incompatible ways of being while individuation provides the overarching framework for authentic self-development. Here's a practical daily framework for integration. Each morning, spend 10 minutes in active imagination, creating a psychological container for the day ahead. Throughout the day, practice shadow work by consciously engaging with difficult perceptions rather than suppressing or identifying with them. Use amplification to decode symbolic or metaphorical information that emerges. Apply type consciousness by honoring your natural way of processing information rather than forcing yourself to conform to others' expectations. End each day with individuation reflection, asking yourself, how did I honor my authentic nature today? What did I learn about my unique gifts and challenges? How can I more fully become who I truly am? This integrated approach transforms the burden of excessive sensitivity into what Jung called a meaningful life, one in which your psychological gifts serve not just personal survival, but contribute to collective healing and evolution. Let's return to where we began, the recognition that being highly intuitive in a predominantly sensory world can feel like a curse. But here's the profound transformation that these Jungian tools make possible. What initially appears to be a psychological burden can become your greatest source of strength, wisdom, and contribution to the world. Jung understood something that modern psychology often misses. Highly intuitive individuals serve a crucial evolutionary function. You're the early warning system for collective psychological health. The pattern recognizes who can see emerging problems before they become crises, the bridge builders who can perceive connections that others miss. But this crucial function can only be fulfilled when you have the psychological tools to work with your gifts consciously rather than being overwhelmed by them. The 5 tools we've explored, active imagination, shadow work, amplification, type consciousness, and individuation, provide the framework for this transformation. Here's what changes when you implement these tools consistently. Instead of feeling constantly overwhelmed by what you perceive, you develop the capacity to engage consciously with psychological material. Instead of feeling isolated by your different way of seeing the world, you develop appreciation for your unique gifts. Instead of feeling like a victim of your sensitivity, you become an active participant in psychological reality. Most importantly, you stop trying to be someone you're not and begin the profound work of becoming who you truly are. This isn't just personal development. It's what Jung called a service to humanity, because the world desperately needs people who can perceive and articulate what others cannot see. The path isn't easy. Developing these tools requires patience, practice, and often the support of others who understand your psychological nature. But the alternative, spending your life trying to suppress or manage gifts that are meant to be developed, is far more difficult and ultimately destructive. So here's our challenge to you. Choose one of the 5 tools and begin implementing it this week. Pay attention to how it changes your relationship with your perceptual gifts. Notice how it affects your energy level, your emotional stability, and your sense of purpose. Tell us in the comments which tool resonates most strongly with you and what you discover as you begin to work with it. Like this video if it's helped you understand your intuitive nature in a new way, and subscribe for more deep explorations into the psychology of consciousness and human potential. Most importantly, share this with other highly sensitive, intuitive individuals who may be struggling with the burden of seeing too much, feeling too deeply, and knowing too much for their own comfort. Let them know they're not alone, they're not crazy, and their gifts are desperately needed in this world. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of intuitive consciousness. Your willingness to develop and share your perceptual gifts offers hope for a world that desperately needs deeper seeing, greater wisdom, and more conscious engagement with psychological reality. Keep seeing, keep feeling, keep intuiting, and remember that your sensitivity is not a flaw to be fixed, but a gift to be honored and developed. Until next time, trust your perceptions, develop your gifts, and never apologize for seeing what others cannot see.